Could we start then with a kind of a question that often flummoxes people, actually? So if it flummoxes you, then that's fine. But what does IPE mean to you?
Oh, well, I actually like Susan Strange's definition of it better than any others, where she argues that the discipline that people who think they're studying international relations are really studying is international political economy or global political economy, because the politics and economics are completely intertwined, and it's impossible to understand one without the other. And the people who are doing what they sometimes think of themselves as doing as international relations is really just looking at a little tiny part of diplomacy and the use of weaponry in the larger field of international political economy. So I actually do see it as the larger unit to which the field of international relations is a part. I read international economists. Terrible things of that sort. Some of them are even my friends. I don't really think the disciplines are separate.
Okay. And do you think of yourself as a scholar of IP? Because that's one of the things that people sometimes say is, I'm sort of IP, but I'm also something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, I'm something else. I think of myself as a scholar of global political economy, if I remember to call it global, but since it's been called international political economy for a long time, I probably slipped that way. I also think of myself as a lapsed Africanist, but that's really where I started. When I was an undergraduate, I had a chance to do a program called Interfuture, which taught American undergraduates and European undergraduates. The program was centered in New York and Amsterdam. Taught undergraduates how to do social research, individual social research while they were undergraduates. And you had to study a problem in your own country, another industrialized country, and in developing country. And I ended up looking at the negotiations that led to the International Cocoa Agreement of 1973 and its impact on marginal cocoa farmers in Ghana. And that took me to the United States, where I spent a lot of time looking at the chocolate manufacturing industry and their impact on this agreement, and then to Great Britain, which was another place where the chocolate industry had a great deal of impact on the agreement. And then I went to Ghana, which in those days was the major producer of cocoa in the world, and was in the central part of the country and got tied on to a research team that was looking at the lives of marginal cocoa farmers, people who own some land but not enough land that they can actually make enough to feed their families, so they also have to sell their labor to other farmers as well. And I've basically been doing the same thing ever since then, that is studying really international cooperation aimed at improving the lives of people who are screwed by the global economy.
That's a really good summary of what I think the real importance of IP is, really. Yeah. So what was the first time you became conscious of this new discipline of IP? Because presumably at undergraduate, when you did the work in Africa originally, you weren't studying IP.
No, although I certainly was reading political economy, and a lot of the scholars and work that I thought was really important was work that even quite self-consciously called itself work in political economy. It was really during my graduate work. I was at the University of North Carolina from 1974 through 1980 when I received my PhD, that you first started to hear the phrase of something called international political economy. There were people coming out of business schools, primarily in the United States, who were writing about this kind of international political economy idea. And then in my first job, which was, I started in 1979 at Johns Hopkins University, I ran into Christopher Chase Dunn, who was putting together a subgroup of the International Studies Association that he said was going to be called the International Political Economy Group, and did I want to join the conspiracy? So I would say 1979, from 1979 onward, I knew I was in this thing called international political economy.
And who were the major influences on you then? So Chris Chase-Dunn was one of them, perhaps.
Well, yes, certainly as a friend. There was another colleague at Johns Hopkins who was really influential for me. Was Nancy Hartsock, who's a feminist political theorist, Marxist feminist. Although, as she said, it had been a number of years since she stopped worrying about the woman problem in Marxism and had started to worry about the working class problem in feminism. So Nancy was certainly a major influence at the time. And then there were some of the faculty back at North Carolina, some of whom most people probably have not heard of. My dissertation advisor was a guy named Andrew Scott, who primarily worked on what he considered to be complex international systems, which included the economy. He was really one of the early people writing on environmental issues globally. And then there was a very, very junior sociologist named Craig Calhoun, who was kind of hung out with the graduate students as well as with the people over in sociology. And he sort of thought that he was doing something that might be called political economy and rather internationally as well.
Right, okay, that's great, thank you. So what if you were to be pushed, what would you say your major contribution to the field has been?
Well, I don't know whether... I think my major contribution is actually something that is in the book International Organization and Industrial Change, but is also before and after that, which is really a recognition that the international cooperation and international institutions, the things that we call modern global governance, were originally promoted by globalizing capitalists, that the goal of the international organization system was to do the work of expanding the markets that were encouraged, were something that capitalists wished to do. So that's the first part. And then the second part is that in every phase of growth of the global governance system, it has started out with a failure of people who are essentially capitalists and they're lackeys. Well, let's put it this way. People who are theorizing about how to create international cooperation who have a very simplistic version of liberalism, who create institutions that would create more completely unregulated global governance at a higher level. They fail, and then you have a second wave in each case of people that I call critical liberals, many of whom are hanging out and dealing with like Pan-Africanists and feminists and Marxists and all kinds of other things, who are the real designers of the sets of institutions that then the United Nations system, like the late 19th century public international unions, and things that happened a little bit earlier in terms of the integration of both the German and the American economies, which were really international organizations themselves, but that's another story.
So one of the things I thought when I first read your work, in fact, that book, I remember because I studied with Rawdon Wilkinson, I remember him presenting me with your book in his office. And I had a line in the PhD, which was something like, Murphy is unusual among people drawing on Gramsci because of the positive way in which he regards liberal internationalism.
I think that... I mean, I think I am unusual among many of the contemporary scholars of Gramscian scholars. I don't think I'm that far off from the way Gramsci himself understood liberal internationalism. I mean, or the way Karl Marx did, for that matter. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the expansion of markets through the integration of Germany, through the integration of the United States, and the Civil War, which is really when the critical liberals make it possible for the United States to establish a integrated market. and in the late 19th century, and then the United Nations system. In each one of these cases, yes, what's going on is the perfection of capitalism over a larger scale, but it is equally the case, or it is also the case, that these folks who are involved in establishing each one of these systems, the most recent one being sort of the United Nations system, which was just established on the basis of the arguments of the so-called four freedoms that Roosevelt spoke about. This actually expanded human freedom to some extent in each one of these cases, and made it possible for all the groups that were previously oppressed in other ways to gain some degree of freedom. People benefited from each one of these cases. So yeah, interestingly enough, Gramsci was a follower of the work by the International Chamber of Commerce and by those who were trying to pull together a European rail system and a European road system. And he wrote not negatively about these things. These are things that hardly ever get translated from the prison manuscripts into English. But he wrote positively about these things as things that were creating a different level at which capitalism would operate, and they were political sites. And I think of the United Nations system as a political site, where a kind of progressive politics goes on as well.
Okay, and here we are at the ISA this week. No doubt many of the panel discussions will in some way problematize perhaps a retreat from liberal internationalism. So I wondered if you had any, and I've read some of the recent commentaries you've written around that, both about the rise of the BRICS and perhaps what implications that has for the liberal international system we have, but also the kind of more recent populist politics around integration and liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the period of this is going to sound flip, and it's too much of a historical analogy, and there are problems with historical analogies, etc. But if you think of the interwar period, and with the recognized failure of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations was associated with an attempt to have the global economy controlled simply by businessmen. There was a conference in Atlantic City that Woodrow Wilson thought was wonderful, that the International Chamber of Commerce ran, and they were going to create the norms for the international economy. But what happened in the 30s is that economic system did not function properly. It was able to sustain a boom for about 9-10 years, and then fell apart, and you ended up with a sort of three-sided politics, or 4 or 5-sided politics. But among those who were supporters of capitalism, there was a three-sided politics, where on the one hand you had people who were associated with kind of arguments about classical liberalism, and we should do everything in what we would now call a neoliberal way, in which there are no regulations, blah, 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 blah. So think about, Blair. Oh, sorry, we're not supposed to say that he would be part of that, but so you have that kind of group, or Hillary Clinton. Then you have the second group, is you have a group of racist nationalists who said that an expanded liberal economy has fallen apart, and what we really need is the reconstruction of national imperial economies. National imperial economies. Both of those words are actually central, and that's Mussolini. That's Hitler. That is also Franco and the fascists in Portugal. Again, the empire matters in each one of those cases. Oh my God, we've got exactly the same thing now. We have both the neoliberals and those guys, and then there was a third way, but not in that sense, that was the ideas that were coming from people like John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, my goodness, talking about these people as if they were positive. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in fact, was arguing these kinds of positions, and being supported by people from not the far left, but at least the socialist left, throughout Europe and throughout the United States. And these are the people that I would talk about as the critical liberals who actually created the post-war order. So if I'm looking at the politics today, I'd say we're spending an awful lot of time, much too much time, talking about those who are presenting the nationalist, imperialist view of how to get out of the current situation. Those who continue to parade some kind of view of neoliberalism as, we just have to perfect this and it's all going to be better, and not spending enough time looking at and creating alliances among those who would be in that middle position. I really enjoyed the last elections in the United States because a lot of those kinds of people won and are now sitting in Congress. We'll see how long that lasts.
Yes, absolutely. And so how are these kinds of concerns motivating your work now? I know you've got a big project that you're
I'm writing a short book right now. It actually is a short book.
Right,
it looks like I know when I describe it's 15 chapters and all of that sort of thing, it sounds like it's an incredibly long book. It's actually quite a short book. And as one of my colleagues sort of joked with me, he said, "Oh, so you're writing the historical philosophical underpinnings of the Green New Deal?" And I said, well, yes, if you understand that as a global Green New Deal, not as something that's applied to the United States. Yeah, that is actually what I'm trying to do, is trying to say why a politics of complex solidarity is necessary to deal with the current global real problems, which the deepest problems are not necessarily global populism, but the global environmental crises and the inequalities that have actually gotten worse throughout the period of the former global New Deal. And yes, so that is actually, those issues are exactly what motivate the work that I'm doing now.
Just on that question, do you think there are links between the kind of the imperatives of, certainly of the inequality question, perhaps less so even if it's more urgent on the climate issue, and the populism and the populist challenge?
Oh, certainly. I mean, one of the things that has motivated or at least encouraged a certain versions of populist politics throughout the industrialized world has been the ability of relatively small parts of the capitalist leadership, shall we put it, who are deeply tied to the dirty industries of the previous period, to find ways to say that their agenda is exactly the same agenda as that of the white male working class, and particularly in rural areas. And this is not just, this sounds like a story that one could find lots of examples of in the United States or in Canada or perhaps in Australia, but it's actually a story that goes across Europe as well. It's an argument about a type of free life that we white men with big trucks and diesel really wish to be able to pursue. Now, this is a really weird combination, and it should be understood as kind of a weird combination of how these things fall together. We have people in the western part of the United States, members of Congress, saying that the Green New Deal, and in fact everything that the left of the Democratic Party in the U.S. is doing, is genocide against a particular form of life that they are part of. And this is this kind of idea that the Western culture, the Western United States culture, is one that is supposedly white, which is a little weird in terms of many things, especially history, but that it's white and that it's somehow deeply tied to the use of fossil fuels. Well, that's bizarre, but it is an idea that has gained resonance. I mean, it is a kind of an idea of what Gramsci would think of as a political party that has been quite successful, not only there, but also, in Germany and in France and a few other places as well. So yes, I do think that this is essentially connected.
Just returning then to the discipline of IPE, one of the things that or global political economy, as you described it at the outset, one of the things that spurred the development of the discipline, arguably, is that it was able to intellectually come to terms with some of the practical political challenges of the day around the collapse of Bretton Woods and so on. And I wonder, do you think, given that raft of challenges that you've just outlined, do you think IPE or global political economy is well equipped at the moment to deal with these kinds of challenges intellectually, to understand them?
I think there are elements of global political economy, people doing real work in global political economy that are certainly capable of doing that. But I don't think that the entire field is really directed toward that at all. And I think there's learning that GPE people have to do with social scientists and historians and archaeologists, for example, in other fields, as well as, in fact, climate scientists, which is something like terribly scary for many of us. We are not very good. Or there's a way in which it's odd that much of the economics of inequality, the historically based economics of inequality, the work that's being done by people like Piketty or by Milanovic, has not become central to the discussion of IPE. It should be. This is really sensible work. It is painfully sensible work, but it should be brought back in. I mean, I know they're economists, but nonetheless, we have lost perhaps some of the connections to the economic history that's done by economists who are concerned with data, not the economic history, the thing that's called economic history, which is applying economic models to data that's already been collected in them, about the past. And so I think there's a great deal of work that needs to be done connecting IPE people to that sort of work. And we also, frankly, need to be much more attentive to questions of gender and race. We're not terrible about connections to post-coloniality and thinking about the developing world. Those ties are sitting right here in the international political economy groups here at the ISA or at VISA. But actually, the connections to thinking about race and gender are a little bit weaker, and we need to realize that those folks have been doing a great deal of critically important work at that.
Okay, thank you. So, given what you've just said, then, who are the key scholars that are influencing you now? Who are you reading?
Wow, who am I reading? Well, I mean, some of them are people who write, everything Spike Peterson writes, I think, is right on and right exactly where we need to be thinking. I'm greatly influenced by people who I had overlooked a lot in the past. I like W.E.B. Du Bois primarily, rethinking my own understanding of the late 19th century, the post-slave system, global economy. I think that's Du Bois's work has been, I'd read a lot of it before, but boy, with eyes that were blinkered. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, that's great. And if you were giving advice to a new scholar, somebody, perhaps a new PhD student contemplating setting out on that journey, what would you say to them in terms of, say, focus or the methods to employ, or just general advice?
Well, I definitely say try to ask big questions, not small questions, and that this is something that I think you'll probably interview a lot of other old farts who are much more mainstream than I, and they'll turn out to be saying the same sort of thing. That one of the difficulties right now is perhaps in the field is the larger questions are not being asked. So that even if it's difficult and your dissertation advisor is telling you not to do it, try to ask the bigger questions rather than the smaller questions. Don't be afraid of creating your own data. And that's probably would be the most important methodological thing. That if you're going to do work that is, whether it's cross-sectional or historical, it is much more important to be able to go to original records or to go and sit and interview people or whatever, and work with sources of data, sources of information that actually directly relate to the questions that you're trying to ask, rather than to go to sources of data that are easily available. Again, you might get a lot of advice from your dissertation advisor that that's not the way to do it, but really you're going to make a contribution to our understanding much more by doing that than by going and finding the data. Then one final thing, it would be, and this will sound odd, I did my PhD in a political science department connected with a social science program at the University of North Carolina, which at the time was probably one of the most highly quantitative and sophisticated mathematical places in the United States. And I took 6 different graduate courses in mathematical and statistical methods. But part of the culture of the University of North Carolina at that time was that you always used the least sophisticated mathematical method that you could to actually make the argument that you needed to make, to actually prove the point or point in the direction that you did. So that the part of the the culture of the place where I went to school was one of be sophisticated in your mathematical abilities, but don't show those abilities out in front of people, because you're trying to communicate to the largest audience possible, which means actually use the methods that are necessary, but not beyond what seems to be necessary. This is not a culture that exists in that many places, but it's one that's well worth returning to.
Okay, that's wonderful. That brings me to the end of my questions, but something I always do when I'm interviewing people is say, before we started, or as we've been going through, is there a question that you think we should have asked you?
Yeah, you probably should have asked questions about my specific relationships to some of the people that you had in the back of your mind as some of the key folks.
Okay.
Like Stephen Gill or others who were sort of my same cohort, and how we may have gotten together at different periods of time.
Yeah, so tell us, how do you relate to those people? Particularly, I suppose, Bob Cox, but then obviously Gill and others. And you mentioned Spike.
Cox, I first got to know through attending a panel at an ISA meeting in the early 1980s, where he was talking about Gramsci. And then I rudely, sent him work, and he responded generously. And it's like, oh my goodness, this kind of important person would actually respond to stuff that I've written about, just because he'd been writing about the same sort of thing, like Gramsci and international relations, and he was concerned with North-South relations, which I was deeply concerned with, and he was concerned with the UN system. So it's primarily, I got to know Cox because of his own, his generosity to someone who was not his student, but was just, someone out there. I think Stephen and I became friends in a somewhat similar way. Stephen kind of figured out that I was doing some stuff that had Gramsci in the title and that sort of thing, and he was pulling together what was going to be a book for the Cambridge series, and asked me if I would be involved with that with my then frequent co-author and Italian diplomat and Enrico Gelli. Stephen and I had a mutual friend in why am I forgetting? Anyway, never mind. But it was again an academic connection being made by people sort of reaching out to others who they'd heard about who were doing somewhat similar work. And I think a lot of my most important intellectual connections came from either me reaching out or someone else reaching out to me because we sort of looked like we were doing the same thing. So maybe we should get together. And one of the things to graduate students is never ignore those kinds of somebody sending you an email or meeting you at an ISA meeting or visa meeting, and don't ignore them, because those are going to be the people that the rest of your life is going to be connected to, and if you miss them, you're going to miss them.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. That was a really superb discussion.